All right, everybody. Without further ado, I'm really excited and pleased to announce this panel about a little piece of legislation called the Inflation Reduction Act. This one's a really exciting one because our students developed this panel. It was a topic they brought to us and developed and reached out to our moderator and panelists. So that was our students from the Longhorn Energy Club and the TechSea program. If you want to know more about the TechSea program, just come ask. And without further ado, yet again, this is Sean Cumberland, our moderator with NCAP Investments, and enjoy.
Thank you very much, Nora. Can you guys hear me? So I have been involved in the development and investing in the power sector for over 3 decades. The last half of that has been on renewables. So I've seen a lot of things change. This act that just passed, half a year ago, there's been a lot of superlatives used to describe it, but it truly is audacious and unprecedented in terms of both scope and scale. It's had some impacts already in the United States and is expected to have dividends continue here, but it's besides just on our shores here, it's kind of done things offshore already. We've had at least 2 impacts across the pond in Europe where they've reacted both in terms of a wake-up call. Today I saw an announcement that the EU have announced increased targets for their conversion into renewables on their energy sector. That was announced today. But then it also sort of rankled them a little bit in terms of, is it unfair for how we're going to help manufacturers? I think the governments are trying to sort that out and they'll come to a thing, but it's had an impact more than just here. And this panel that we have is really cool. It's great because it's not just people like me that are investing in it that are represented on the panel, but Andy Bowman is truly a pioneer in the industry. He's been involved in renewables going back into the 90s, and he can talk about his career, but he's seen legislation and the impacts, over time in his sector. Courtney here she's at the RBC, which is a bank that provides both debt capital and playing involved in tax benefits and tax equity partnerships. So it'll be great to hear what IRA means to them. Jay Chang is at CCA, which is a niche advisory firm that helps companies like Andes and projects arrange tax benefits to sort of sort through this. And then, wow, to have Luke here on the panel. Luke was part of the senior staff of Joe Manchin. For anyone who was following as the drama was unfolded, all roads went through Joe. And so I'm sure he saw a lot. I mean, there's probably a lot of people who want to hear that, but it'll be great to get his perspective on the act as well. But if we could just go down the chain and give a little bit more biographical background and then some sort of snippet about sort of your thoughts on the IRA and maybe how it impacts you guys, and then we'll jump into the Q&A, the moderation. Courtney?
Hi, everyone. I am Courtney Mooney. I am a director at RBC Capital Markets. I am ahead of their investor relations for their renewable energy syndication platform and as well as their direct investment platform. My role is finding investors who are interested in taking tax credits or presenting internally to our board to get approval for RBC to directly invest in tax credits. Prior to joining RBC, I was at Nixon Peabody for over 8 years, where my background is legal. I was a lawyer at my previous job. So I represented a lot of syndicators and direct investors in tax credit transactions, teaching them the structures, understanding kind of the tax implications of these deals. So I'm bringing a lot of that to my role at RBC Capital Markets. As far as what the IRA means to a syndicator or a direct investor, I think this is opening up a lot of opportunities. RBC was typically investing mostly in solar partnership flip ITC deals, but now we have more opportunities for different types of assets and different tax credit types as well.
My name is Jay Chang. I'm with CCA Group. I've been with CCA Group for about 5 years, and we're a boutique investment bank that focuses on M&A and equity capital markets. We help developers and sponsors raise tax equity capital, or on the M&A side, help acquire or dispose of renewable energy assets. Prior to CCA, I was at MUFG, where for 9 years I was on the principal investing side, making tax equity investments.
So I'm Andy Bowman. I'm CEO of Jupiter Power. We're a company based here in Austin that focuses on energy storage. But my background, as Sean mentioned, goes back. I'm a long timer in renewables. I started in the 1990s and done a lot of wind and then a lot of solar, and now doing a lot of storage. You know, I've seen over my career a great deal of, you know, ink around the PTC and then the ITC, and I'd agree with Sean that the effect of this bit of legislation here is really extraordinary. I think it's much bigger than you know, one would glean from just reading about, you know, it here and there. From my perspective, you know, over 25 years doing these kinds of projects, we were constantly waiting out the expiration and then the renewal of first PTC and then ITC. Generally, this would authorize it for, you know, a couple years, 2 or 3 years, and we'd be working on projects that would take, you know, 3, 4, 5 years to get done. And then you're always sweating out, well, will it exist when I'm, you know, ready to go to construction finance, or will it not? And there'd be huge cliffs and then peaks and valleys in the construction, all around the drama of, was there going to be an ITC or a PTC available or not? So one of the biggest things, there are 3 things I would emphasize from my perspective that this bill is really extraordinary in its effects. One of them is in putting forward a really long, substantial window for this credit to be available that fits well with the scale of investment that this sector is looking at over the next 10 years. For the first time, we've got this kind of a really long runway. And that provides, you know, I think our IRENA report yesterday talked about $35 trillion of new investment needed if we were going to hold to the 1.5 degrees Celsius emissions target by 2030. You know, that's a very tall goal, but a 10-year runway gives a lot firmer, sounder basis for the kind of investment that's going to be needed to make things move on the carbon front. So that's very exciting. There are also a number of things done with how the credit works that are very important, including in particular the inclusion of energy storage. And I'm sure we'll talk more about those things. But the first one is getting that long runway. The second one is, I would say that a lot of people really wanted direct pay out of this legislation, and where things ended up. And it'll be interesting to hear more about this during the conversation is transferability. That's been a huge innovation and a big change in the legislation that's going to be extremely impactful. And then the third one I would say is this legislation makes a very meaningful change in the manufacturing ecosystem for the first time, especially when you look at things like domestic manufacturing. For the first time, there is a path to getting to seeing the footprint of manufacturing addressed through something like an energy policy. And this legislation is really extraordinary. Some of the lesser discussed aspects of the legislation that are going to be hugely impactful already are when you look at planned manufacturing facilities and jobs around the country. So those are the 3 things I would emphasize.
Hi, everyone. I'm Luke Bassett. I'm a former Senate staffer for the Energy Committee, working for Chairman Joe Manchin. I'm originally from West Virginia. I worked in a handful of different roles in democratic politics and climate policy, clean energy policy, including the Department of Energy and think tank, the Center for American Progress, before joining the Energy Committee back in 2019. And yeah, I think the simplest way of putting it is the Inflation Reduction Act means a lot to me. It It has for quite a few years in various forums, and I'm looking forward to the conversation to walk through as much as I can share or remember from quite a hectic 4-year period, but really looking forward to also hearing from you all.
No, we have a really smart audience here, but we might want to level set on some terminology and like, what is a PTC? What is an ITC? What are we talking about when we're talking about tax equity partnerships? Because they're a little bit complicated, and I don't think the average person quite understands, because it does feed into something that Andy alluded to in terms of transferability and why is that significant. I'll probably start with the first two, production tax credit and investment tax credit, and I'll get some smarter people to talk about tax equity partnerships. But an investment tax credit is, as the name sounds, you make an investment in a desired form of capital asset, and then some percentage of that is going to be given back to you in the form of a credit that either you can use or somehow someone else can utilize. But it's more or less having the taxpayers subsidize a cost of building something. And, you know, let's just say around about 30% for a solar plant. A production tax credit is also, as the name implies, and as you produce a megawatt hour, which is how electricity is sort of measured, once a megawatt hour is actually sent onto the grid, the electric power grid, then you receive a payment. And that payment is in the form of a credit over a 10-year period of time. And then you're able to likewise use that as you could the investment tax credit. But you end up finding different ways to monetize those. And that is in addition to whatever electricity payments you could get either by selling into the grid on an open merchant basis or contracting with a third party to buy your electricity as you sold it. So now I got the easy stuff. Andy, do you want to talk about what a tax equity partnership is and why people do those?
Yeah, you know, as Sean's saying, a tax credit can be worth about 30% of your total project cost. And so it's a really substantial benefit. The way that the tax credit, you know, PTC and then ITC have worked heretofore is that you can only take advantage of the credit if you are an owner of the project. And so from the project developer's point of view, or the person building the project, financing it, you'd have to go, and if you don't know that you're going to have a huge tax bill for 10 years, if you're talking about the PTC, then you've got to go find another taxpayer that does have that kind of a tax bill, and you've got to convince them to become an owner with you in your project company when you finance it. And so the legal complexity of joining a party like this into your, you know, special purpose entity for the purpose of financing is really complicated, not only from a legal point of view, but from a kind of a negotiation point of view. Finding those tax investors and then closing these transactions is really burdensome. And there have historically been a small group of people that are sophisticated enough to understand these deals and interested enough. And so from the project developer's point of view, you'd be going to this relatively small group of potential tax investors. You'd be trying to talk them into coming into your project. This might take 3 months, 6 months, millions of dollars in legal fees. And these parties, because of this basic dynamic, and with all due respect to the wonderful tax investors out there in the world, you know, wielded a lot of leverage on the deal terms to get involved. And though that leverage played itself out in all the details of the project, the PPA, the power purchase agreement for the project needed to be of a certain, you know, style to make them happy. You know, a variety of other deal terms, they were in a position to influence, if not require, be done in a certain way. So this process of bringing in tax investment heretofore, prior to the bill, has been extraordinarily burdensome from the project's point of view. The benefit made it worthwhile, but this sets the stage, I think, for one of these innovations of the bill that's going to be so impactful, which is transferability. Should I leave it there, Sean?
No, yeah. That's perfect because you know, as it's turned out, because of rules and custom and other reasons, that grouping has been banks, and so there's a a collection of banks who've invested the time to understand and structure these things and build a franchise to do it. And Courtney represents RBC, who's been involved in this for some time. The amount of capacity that has been available year to year has ranged from about $15 billion to about $20 billion on the high side from that club of banks that have been providing. So Courtney, why don't you talk about your bit of that pie and how much you guys are playing in, and is there an area that you prefer? Is it on the PTCs or the ITCs, wind or solar historically?
Yeah, so we've had a total of about 2.3 billion equity invested to date. So we've been doing our platform for about 7 years. First, we operated just to invest for ourselves. So it was for RBC's, to offset RBC's tax liability or one of our affiliates. About 3 or 4 years ago, we started a syndication platform, which means that we create funds to help other folks invest in these deals. As Andy mentioned, they're very complex. When we act as a syndicator, we take the role of structuring the deals for investors, asset management, because these deals are for 5 or 10 years, depending on which credit you're investing in. So there's some ongoing asset management and review and monitoring that comes with these deals. And if you're an investor who's like, well, I just have tax liability, I really just want the credits, I don't have the internal processes to, manage this investment over 5 or 10 years, it'll come to someone like RBC and we'll do the managing for them. As far as, we've been historically just investing in solar assets, solar ITC specifically. We were very comfortable with a structure called a partnership flip, as Andy mentioned, and I know from the legal side that you spend a lot of months and weeks in doing negotiation on a limited liability partnership agreement or limited liability company agreement that sets all the rights of both the investor and the sponsor. And in that structure, we have a flip after year 5, and that means after 5 years, for the first 5 years, the investor will get the bulk of the benefits, and then after year 5, it will flip down, and then the investor will exit the deal. But with the IRA, we're definitely looking into other types of assets. Solar storage or ITC storage is, a big one. We have a few active deals that we are in the closing process of. We see that as a future. It's great to be able to generate the energy, but what do we do with all the excess energy as well? We see that as a future. Residential side, folks are interested in getting batteries for their homes. So we just see this as kind of the path, the next frontier on the renewable side. Having PTC available for solar deals now. Originally, before the IRA, solar was only available as an ITC, investment tax credit, instead of PTC. So, the PTC solar can be very attractive in states that produce, have a lot of sunshine, have, Texas, other places we've been looking in. So the IRA has definitely, made us think more about, what assets we're investing in and what types of credits are where we are and our investors are interested in.
So Jay, the club of banks seem a bit tapped out in terms of capacity from time to time, and the amount that needs to be built is huge. And there are tons and tons of taxpayers. Can't we just snap our fingers, call you, and you'll arrange a tax equity partnership with us for another taxpayer?
Yeah, I should take a step back, because we've been talking about the 2 tax credits, but maybe give a little bit more for anyone in the audience that doesn't know. The IRS, like Section 45 for the PTC and Section 40 for the ITC, they're very different. So the PTC says you have to be, under IRS code, the owner and the operator. So what's the distinction with the ITC, where you only have to be the owner? The reason that we use these partnership flips is that in order to be the owner operator, you have to invest in the SPE that is physically operating the project. So they may be passive in their role in the entity, but that entity is operating it so they can claim the tax credit. That's why you need these partnerships as opposed to just going in. And the reason why they have to be different is the IRS under these codes says you can't just buy the tax credits. That doesn't work. You have to be able to show that you're a true equity partner. And these partnership flips, the reason they do this is they do what's called disproportionate allocations, where tax investors they don't want to take operational risks. So the partnerships are created as a structure to effectively slice up the project economics where they're deriving most of their return from the tax credits and the not just the tax credits, but the depreciation. Because if you look at these investments, every time a tax investor makes an investment, for every $100, $70 is the tax credit, around $15 is the depreciation net present value, and 15 is the cash. And you say, well, why do they want the cash? They need to show for IRS purposes, economic substance. Otherwise, they are not considered an owner, and they are disqualified from claiming the PTC or ITC. Now that that's level set and why their complexity is there is where as a CCA, a lot of advisors are structuring these deals and trying to get the tax equity investors what they want. But it takes, the reason it's hard and you have a lot of only financial institutions investing in this space is because for financial institutions, that's their core business to do financial engineering and structuring and understanding all these different facets of accounting, risk profile and things like that. When you have other corporate taxpayers who are, for example, one that's entering the market like Nestle, they make chocolate. They don't want to invest in a project that they're going to invest 200 million in and then have to go on an earnings call and explain why something went bust, because that's not their core business, because these are complicated structures. So what did the IRA do? Transferability now short circuits this and says, you don't need to be an owner or operator. I can just sell you the tax credit. And that's what creates this is the big ticket item in the IRA that is intended to unlock and allow all these other corporate investors to come in and support renewable energy projects. But with that being said, renewable energy projects since when was the PTC? 1992, they've relied on tax equity investments where they're getting capital from selling off a portion of the cash and the depreciation. Transferability out of those three items only gets you the tax credit, and they sell it at a discount. Why is that significant? Because now the sponsors the renewable energy world has to now adjust, and the capital stack is going to be different. It's going to be probably 30% more equity from the owners. And the question is will the transferability proceeds be able to make up for the difference that they're losing from a tax equity deal? And that's I think the question of how the industry is going to adapt. But given what we've been through since '92, I'm sure this isn't the worst thing we've been through. So I'm sure it'll take.
So that was sort of one of the revolutionary bits of the bill, right? In the Eureka. Luke, how much discussion did you guys spend on transferability? Because it for the industry, it was quite impactful because of this, bottleneck, if you will.
Yeah, I would say it was to some degree a provision that came up later in the process. And that's in part because early on, even before the beginning of the last Congress, so before the 50-50 split that consumed all of our news feeds for 2 years, the discussion from advocacy groups, from trade associations, from investors and project developers was really focused more on if there's an opportunity to do a reconciliation bill, so particular process in the Senate that has to be tied to budget, so spending or raising revenues for the federal government, then the way to reform the PTC and ITC and tax credits writ large, in addition to the many modifications that Andy mentioned, was to focus on direct pay. And so in that instance, rather than dealing with the complexity of the partnerships that have been described, or this middle ground of transferability, which I'll get back to, you as the project owner or owner operator receive the amount of the tax credit on your own tax bill in a cash payment, basically. My former boss had some issues with that. I think coming out of the passage of the American Rescue Plan at the beginning of the Biden administration, a lot of his just past experience and political philosophy or outlook put them at odds with direct pay. But I think the other part of it is the complexity of the status quo partnerships, the involvement of the banks in a lot of these structures also ensured some amount of due diligence, management, a lot of focus, a lot of people ensuring that projects were solid. And that translated to Senator Manchin being more comfortable with something in the middle, which was transferability, where even the transferability measures that are now in the law are to some degree pretty conservative. It's one transfer. It is guarded with rules that the IRS will promulgate. It's not creating a full market of, a secondary market where tax credits are being traded and people are sort of gaming the system or what have you. But it's also avoiding the direct payment part where it is truly just the government ensuring that the entity, the company or the person claiming the credit has done the due diligence. So I think Senator Manchin's goal with all of that was to find a middle ground where there was more flexibility in project development and project finance, but it also retains some of the due diligence to avoid fraud, to avoid bad projects, because I think none of us wanted to create an instance where projects weren't being developed, operated, and helping the economy move forward in that way.
Thanks, Luke. Like I said, I could corner you for a day. I'm sure everyone could, just to hear all the stories you went through. As I mentioned, the scope also got expanded. Historically, what we've looked at is the tax benefits had been for wind and solar, but the remit got widened to battery storage, carbon capture and storage, hydrogen, et cetera, and so on. As I mentioned, in terms of in our discussions with the normal club of banks that have been providing tax equity partnership and capital for wind and solar, that, wow, there's still so much that I can do in wind and solar. I can use up my entire wallet on that. Investing and learning these new sectors is going to be challenging. Andy, what's your experience right now for folks that are coming into the battery business, and you've got standalone storage battery business?
Yeah. I mean, it's been a small group of tax investors historically that are most experienced with, technologies that are well known, like solar in particular and wind. And so for energy storage coming along, we have this great opportunity now to seek tax investment, and it would be a significant enhancement to the project economics. But there's only so many tax investors. Now there are so many more projects that are attempting to move forward, and as a somewhat novel technology with not only novel technology but novel revenue strategies that constitute the revenue part of the model. There is some learning involved there, and so things like energy storage and some of the other new technologies that are happily included in the bill face a bit of a learning curve, and there's still this relatively fixed universe of available sophisticated tax investors, and transferability, I think, is going to address that positively, but that's going to take some time. And so at the moment, some of these new technologies have a row to hoe to get these deals done, these first deals done. But I think there's a lot of confidence that all that's going to get done, and that there will be, a lot of interest and availability of these tax investors to get involved in these projects too down the road.
Do you expect you'll be doing more transfer credit deals, or are you looking at people in a partnership?
The first energy storage tax credit deal has been announced as being done. We're not that familiar with the details of it. But I think it's a question of optimization of your model. you know, projects are moving forward now with companies like us, energy storage projects. And so the question is, well, are we going to be able to figure these things out to get the most efficient financing done from a tax investment point of view, which will take X period of time? And, you know, our projects are moving at Y rate of speed. And so do those really mesh up? But the nice thing about transferability is that if we do choose to prioritize time, we can come back around and have a simpler transaction that won't be as efficient, but that's also doable when we just show up with the credits that we've earned through the normal turn of events and then have them available to sell, not contingent on a project one day happening, but as a result of a project that has already gone through financing and construction. And those, in theory, will be simpler transactions to close.
Is RBC migrating to the new areas, or are you staying in what you've done
no,
so
we
far?
are definitely very interested in storage. We've been looking at a lot of deals. You know, I agree with you, Andy. There's a lot of educating, you know, both internally, if we're going to invest for ourselves, you know, when we go to our committees, you know, we have to explain to them that, you know, this is a new technology and talk about the benefits, talk about the risks. You know, we have to look at our modeling to make sure it's, you know, reflecting a new asset. But, you know, and then also educating, you know, when we're doing our syndicated platform, educating our investors, because, you know, they're typically used to having a solar ITC. You know, it's just, you know, educating them on these new opportunities, because we really do see them as opportunities. We don't want to be stuck doing just solar deals for eternity, because, you know, that's not going to lead to any growth for us or for the industry either. So, you know, I think we are always looking for more opportunities. We see you know, we like the storage because it's also ITC. We're familiar how the ITC works generally. So we're just, you know, kind of applying a new asset to it. You know, there are other, you know, we're also obviously looking at the other technologies, kind of trying to understand, but I think kind of you know, we kind of see the next steps towards the storage.
Anything in the other areas, the carbon capture or hydrogen?
Carbon capture, we've been definitely talking to our advisors about. You know, we don't have a lot of knowledge or depth of knowledge on that asset internally here. And as I understand these deals, those types of deals take a very, very long time. So, you know, trying to get investors for, you know, a credit that might materialize 2 or 3 years out is harder to convince someone to have a commitment, you know, 2 or 3 years in advance. You know, we are usually, you know, sometimes we even have investors come to us at the end of a tax year in November, October, and say, we really need credits for this year. Can you help us? So, you know, something like carbon capture, you know, is kind of a harder fit for some of our folks. So those, yeah, I would say probably storage and then kind of carbon capture are things we're exploring.
Jay, you're the financial advisor on the table here, and Andy had alluded to optimization. Can you just in simple terms explain why it's not indifferent to do a transfer deal versus one of these complex partnership structures that you mentioned? Just like why is it that why did he use the term optimization?
Yeah, so tax equity, reiterating, if you get a tax equity investment of $100, they're paying $70 for the tax credit, 15 for the cash, 15 for the depreciation. In a transfer deal, in a tax equity deal, the effective advance rate they're giving on an ITC, I'll use an ITC for example, because it's the easiest one. They're effectively paying like 99.9 cents on the dollar for the tax credit. So if the tax credit is $70, it's probably like 70.1 of value they're getting. So they're not really paying a discount on it. When you do a transfer deal, the typical market that I'm seeing these days is like 90 cents on the dollar. So what does that mean? You went from a tax equity deal that was giving you $100 and you were selling the ITC for $70, which had a face value of 70.1. And then now you're about to get $63. That's a big difference because you just lost $7 permanently. Like it's you know, the tax credit buyer is getting that. And you're not getting any makeup from that. So that I think right there, that loss of value is something that has to be adjusted for as developers. They're with development timeframes of 2 to 4 years to get a project. It's going to take some time for the market to adjust to transferability and get used to the new capital structure that's going to finance these projects.
Step up.
Yeah.
How about step up? What is step up? And
so step up is when you do these partnerships, the way the rules are set is that there are two partners. You have the developer who has the asset, and you have the financial party that's contributing money to help finance the asset. When they contribute both of theirs, money is currency, so it's just dollar to dollar. The asset itself is usually put in at fair market value, and typically when it's put in at fair market value, the general rule of thumb is that it can be stepped up to 20% higher. So which means if it costs Andy $100 to construct the asset, he's going to put it into the partnership at $120. And so that's what the tax investor is going to recognize 30% of 120, $36 versus 30% of $100 of his cost, which is $30. So you take on top of that the $36 in a tax equity deal versus in a transferability deal, it's gonna be 90 cents of $30, so $27. So they're gonna lose $8.
Yeah. So I mean, if you can, all things being equal, you'd want to find and do the hard structuring on the tax equity partnership, but for the fact that
correct,
you can't always get over.
Yeah. So transferability, I think, is not looked at as the first line of what a developer is going to see.
Right.
They're going to look at it as they may develop towards it, but that's more of a last resort to be able to monetize the tax credit where they otherwise would have just used the value if they held on to it.
And then sticking with you for a bit, Jay, in terms of transferability, so the hypothesis is you've opened up really the universe of players who might come in because you don't have this complex structure. What's your level of optimism on how fast that these treasury departments, finance departments, that the corporate payers come in to fill the void there, or the need, if you will?
I think it's since August, everyone has been on the phones trying to find corporate investors, and if anything, banks are very critical in that. So banks like RBC, they already have a stable of investors, but it should attract new investors who now the simplicity of just buying a credit is going to make it much more attractive for them to enter the space and be able to invest in renewable energy projects.
All right. Back to our Congress. There was a couple ways it could have been attacked, right? Because it seems like it's really all a game of relatives, right? I can either make renewables cheaper relative to thermals, or I can have thermals recognize the carbon impact and pay for carbon. Has there been any talk about is that even passable in the United States, where you actually do pay for the price of carbon? Did y'all talk about it at all?
Sure. I think if you look back in the past several Congresses, there has almost always been a bill introduced either on the House side or the Senate side that would price carbon either through a tax or in a more indirect way through a clean energy standard. The immediate champions that come to mind are Senator Sheldon Whitehouse from Rhode Island, Senator Brian Schatz from Hawaii, have frequently introduced bills on carbon taxes. Senator Tina Smith from Minnesota has been the champion on a clean energy standard. In all of those cases, there is a lot of discussion. I happen to be the staffer on our team who got to read those bills and spell out the pros and cons to my former boss. But I think all of that hinged on a few factors in this last Congress. First, the political viability in the reconciliation process. I'm happy to answer questions about reconciliation over drinks after this. It was not a fun process by any means, but to put it simply, traditional bills with a lot of policy detail couldn't go through that process. So that kind of immediately kicked out concepts like a clean energy standard. There was the attempt to work through what was described as the Clean Electricity Payment Program. It was budget relevant, but very complicated policy. My boss disagreed with it at the end of that process. And then with carbon pricing with a carbon tax, definitely budget relevant, but I think the end of what you saw in the IRA, a subsidy forward incentive-based approach, was both the most viable for the moment in time, and also to, I think, Senator Manchin's argument about especially the aspects back in places like West Virginia, in coal country, across the United States. We've seen a lot of either disinvestment or jobs leaving those areas, either because of the decline in fossil fuel use, the lack of investment, and to some degree, how that does not overlap with renewable energy resources in a lot of cases. But I think his goal with a lot of what went into the Inflation Reduction Act, including the hundreds of provisions that are not relevant to tax credits or transferability, was to reinvest in places where jobs have been lost in the past several decades. So I think going forward, there will always be another Congress to talk about a carbon tax and potentially move forward on that type of policy. But at least in the last Congress, the move that was successful was heavy investment, a lot of focus on creating jobs in places, again, where they had been lost, and a lot of focus on a technology neutral approach to get to a really broad segment of the energy economy.
Of course, politicians, that's the bread and butter is jobs, and it's important. One of the aspects of the bill that was innovative, we alluded to, was the onshoring manufacturing. How critical was that to getting the whole package done? Did that factor heavily?
Yeah, I think ask pretty much any senator, both sides of the aisle, to your point, what the most important part of thinking through bills that are focused on the economy. It's generally, how does this create jobs or keep jobs in my state? And in a place like West Virginia or across the river in Ohio or up north in Pennsylvania, a lot of those jobs have historically been tied to extractive industries, coal, timber, and so on, manufacturing. And I think everyone probably understands the trends in the past few decades have reshaped a lot of those places. So, early on, Senator Manchin said, I really want to focus on policies that reinvest, that bring factories, that bring the way we produce energy technologies back to where we've seen coal mines close or coal power plants retire. And it led to a lot of discussions with his colleagues, a lot of discussions at the staff level. And I think it reshapes not just the domestic conversation. You were talking about the European response to the Inflation Reduction Act, but I think even more, it will have really long-term effects if a lot of the economic benefits are not just in the Bay Area, in Austin, no offense, or in the sort of DC to Boston corridor. If these benefits, if these good jobs are shared broadly across the country, then you also start to reshape a lot of the political thinking around what the set of issues means to people, because you're sort of addressing the issue at their kitchen table where it matters most.
I'm going to ask you one question. You got something to say, and then I want to open it up. But I've known you for a while, and I know that you're personally passionate. I mean, it's a job for you, but it's also a passion for you. By the way, he wrote a book called "How a West Texas Power Plant Saved the World." Go out and buy it. You've been. This is important to you personally. How optimistic are you? We've talked about some of the challenges of the bill. How optimistic are you for what this does for decarbonization?
Yeah, I mean, as I was saying at the beginning, it's hard to overestimate how consequential this bill is going to be from a United States energy policy point of view. And I think the work that Luke did and all of the senators and other staffers, it's such a thoughtful bill, and it's so It's so carefully drafted and so intensive in so many ways. There's a lot of that you know, we wouldn't be getting into in a panel discussion like this, but in particular, the jobs part and the manufacturing part. When you look back to the prior administration, there was basically, you open the toolbox and there was a tariff. And like, that's what we did to try to create jobs here. It is economically, from a purely policy economic point of view, it's a very blunt instrument with a lot of inefficiencies. One thing that I really love about this bill so much, or this legislation so much, is that it took such a creative, different, and incredibly effective different look at this issue. When you look at, if we put up a map right now of the United States and all of the, and I'm only talking about batteries because that's the thing I'm most focused on right now. But when you look at all of the battery manufacturing plants that are planned around the United States, and they're not in San Francisco, they're not in Austin, they're in the, you know, the flyover states. I mean, they're being built everywhere. And not only has the bill already been so effective in that, but it's also effective in securing our supply of rare minerals that are really needed for all of this new equipment to be built, not just from the United States, but from our key allies, Australia and Chile and Canada and other countries. So my excitement about this comes from somebody who has labored a long time, wondering, you know, what's Congress doing now? Like, is it ever going to pass? What kind of a meaningful long-term policy have we adopted? This legislation puts one in place. It could be better in ways, but it is such a meaningful basis for investment. And there is so much that can come out of this that is directly aligned with the things that we need to be doing. As you say, climate change is a major concern of mine personally, and I'm sure many of you. And just from a pure business point of view, in a lot of ways, climate change is an infrastructure problem. Every new kind of generation that doesn't create emissions that gets built is a big step forward. And this bill really paves the way in a very meaningful way for a lot of those to happen, and in a way that is politically smart and that is economically smart for the country. So I'm very excited about this and really much more optimistic than I was before.
Is there anything else before we open it up?
No.
Any questions? I don't know how we get. Construction plus equity, because I know there's people who provide construction to take out finance, take out debt. I'll let you take this, and Jay, you as well, Courtney.
Yeah, I mean, there are options to have, you know, construction and then equity combined. We mostly see like a takeout situation where there's another lender doing the construction finance, and then equity comes in to pay off that lender. Is kind of more typical structure. Yeah, there.
So, at least from our portfolio companies, there's a number of lenders that will provide a construction loan, and it's called a construction loan to term. And then it gets paid off by the term by the same lender. And so there are certain banks that specialize only in the back end of that, but then there's some that will do both. But what's really interesting in terms of how it ties into the IRA is that I think we're just kind of getting there on the amount of banks, because a lot of the banks that would provide that construction finance would want to see that you had the tax equity partner that was there, that was going to put in that 30% or more, if it was a PTC deal, of the capital once it meets, you know, sort of its construction milestones, right? Because that was part of the takeout of construction finance. And that appears to be evolving, at least from our window at NCAP. Jay, do you have a different perspective about that?
Yeah, I mean, when you look at the pool, like you've got the two tranches, you've got debt and you've got equity. The tax equity part, are there tax equity investors that give on the debt side loans? That's very rare. They're probably only about, there used to be more, but like if, just to take a step back on the debt side, if you look at who the lenders are, it's more about, it's European banks and they're Asian banks. And why? Because they're used to renewable assets from much longer. They have much more experience with them. They're willing to lend at much longer amortization terms, 18 years, 20 years, 25 years, because they have experience with it. And what's the other reason is because these are from a risk-adjusted, from just an absolute perspective, they're low margin because they're usually like LIBOR or SOFR now, plus 100 to 200 basis points. Asian banks, which have a glut of deposits, they're looking for that to offset their deposit base. Whereas US banks, they have a different motivation and they don't typically play in the project finance market as active as the European banks. The US banks are the ones that provide tax equity. So it's rare for you to see a subset that does both.
What's new right now is that, you know, so before, if I had a big solar plant that was going to go try to arrange construction finance, typically I had to go find the tax equity partner to agree to be there when it was ready and when it was commissioned and online. Then it was going to pay the project and it could pay the part of the construction finance off. With transferability, and you don't have always that takeout transfer lined up yet because this is just evolving, it's nascent. There are only a few banks that we know that would actually take the risk, but they'll take it at a deep haircut assumption on what you're going to transfer it out. So instead of 90 cents where it might actually trade, they might underwrite it at 80 cents or something like that is what we've seen so far. Any other?
Picking up on the last point made by Mr. Bowman, talked about the extraction of the minerals and then the battery plants. Between those two functions, there is the processing of the minerals to get into the battery plants. Have there been any processing facilities or construction talked about for completion in the US? Because most of that process is currently controlled by China.
I mean, I can say that I've heard of processing facilities moving forward, but I think that, you know, I can't speak in more detail about which ones are moving forward where. I just don't happen to know that level of detail. But what I do feel like this legislation is set up is a lot of support for those kinds of things happening here in the United States and amongst amongst a short list of countries that we have had historically close and certainly will continue to have historically close relations with going forward. And so I think, you know, what we've seen over the last few years is how problematic the supply chain can be for complicated stuff, whether it's a washing machine or a battery or a solar panel. And we've seen that, you know, create all kinds of trouble all over the world. Another great thing about this legislation is it is supporting the creation of a much more closer to home with a lot less ways to go wrong supply chain. That's primarily, you know, us and countries that we're very close with already. And so I see that as another benefit. I guess I'm saying I would expect those kinds of processing facilities to be coming along and incented by the system that's put in place here too. But it's a good question. I don't have a more specific answer than that, unfortunately.
Thank you so much on your wonderful insights on transferability. My question is, on one side, we talked about the benefits transferability is going to bring going forward, but also we talked about the potential reduction in value. My question lies around, like, where do you see the break-even point when it comes to small-scale developers? Where would you choose one over the other, like going via the traditional equity route or going via transferability route? Like, could it be a deal size? Could it be WACC or some other parameter? Where would you choose one over the other?
Could you say just one more time? Where's the break even on what?
Yeah, so like if you want to decide if you want to choose the transferability route or the traditional tax equity route, where would that break even could lie about? Like when you want to choose one over the other?
You would always choose the partnership if you could find a counterparty. Yeah, I mean, it's all stacked in your favor. I mean, you get the partner will take, you can talk about it, the partner will take the accelerated depreciation benefits and pay for them. So you got the time value of that. The step up, which is meaningful, it increases basically the effective base by 20%. And then just the handicapping that you get when you do a transfer deal versus a partnership deal. So you will always do that. What's interesting though is projects do have inflection points about whether or not they do PTCs versus ITCs. And that has to do with the quantity of capital that goes into it and the utilization rates. And then you have like, you know, you're solving for sometimes a third party sort of equation, like, well, could I get a partner in one, but not a partner in another? Because it's really interesting. These folks who play in the tax equity partnership, you know, they may not like the long dated 10-year products, but they'll want the ITC one, is mentioned by RBC, or, you know, one minute they like Texas, the next they don't, you know, so you're trying to match them all like this. Well, gee, do they like that or this one here?
Yeah,
and you're solving for
yeah, every investor has a different preference. You know, with the ITC, you're going to get the credit the first year. PTC, you're going to get it upfront. So, you know, some folks are familiar in the low-income housing space where that is a 10-year credit. So maybe they'll like the PTC, but, you know, other folks only do ITC because that's what they're used to and that's what they need.
Go ahead.
Hi. I wanted to see what you thought about what effect the failure of Silicon Valley Bank might have on the, I guess, momentum created by the Inflation Reduction Act.
Great question.
Just from a political standpoint, I think that it probably, especially given the Congress's now shift to oversight and thinking through banking writ large, it may have an effect sort of in the medium term over how banks pursue project finance. I think specifically my understanding of Silicon Valley Bank's assets and projects in general, it largely affects more of the startup side of things. And so especially where either the tax credits were focused on more nascent technologies or the other parts of the Inflation Reduction Act and other bills like the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, the CHIPS and Science Act, where those were focused more on startups, smaller companies, newer technologies, it may have a dampening effect on that side of things. But as far as actual project finance deals, I don't know if the others on the panel have ideas.
Yeah, we're putting the 20 billion in. I mean, it's pretty concentrated. Two players representing 60% of the market. We get one more question here. Then we wrap it up. I think we're over.
Perfect. What is your opinion on the longevity of this law? You know, given the possibility that the administration changes in the coming years, we have goals that go out to 2030 to 2050, given the composition of the courts. How safe or vulnerable do you think the stipulations of this act are?
That one sounds for you, buddy.
Yeah, there are a few ways to think about it. First, you know, if you, for instance, read through the House Majority's first bill, H.R. 1, there are several provisions from the Inflation Reduction Act that are proposed for being repealed. So already there is some political view of what should be undone from the last Congress. Setting that aside, I think that there is both the ongoing and intensifying problem of climate change. There are also all of the other aspects of what the Inflation Reduction Act and the other bills passed in the last Congress do, whether that's focusing on global competitiveness, that's most commonly talked about in the context of chips with the semiconductor manufacturing industry, but it's definitely across the board with the supply chains for all of these energy technologies. And I think the hopeful thing about some of the manufacturing and where projects get built, one of the success stories that my guess is investment decisions were already made before the law got passed, but one of the early success stories in the manufacturing side of things is the company Hanwha Q-Cells building its plant in Dalton, Georgia. That is, I went to school in Atlanta. There's a need for that type of manufacturing in North Georgia. It's a great part of the country. And if people there are working in a solar manufacturing plant, hopefully that changes some of the local politics and that feeds up to the federal level as well. So both on the side where you see investments, jobs being created, I think there's a goal for this whole set of bills to kind of make this topic and set of topics less divisive, make it less of a political football. There is always the question of what the next Congress, whatever the political outcomes are, might do in a reconciliation process, in part because reconciliation was also the vehicle through which President Trump and the Congress at that time passed the tax cuts, I believe, in 2017. So it's a vehicle where you can do a lot to raise revenue, cut revenue, change the budget. But I think broadly, especially as investors move forward and make the business case for all of these things, it reshapes the political narrative around the energy sector, clean energy, emission reductions, all of it.
Great question. Join me in thanking this wonderful panel. Really appreciate you guys being here, all of y'all.
Thanks, you guys. Well, it's time for lunch. So we have about a 45-minute break. Remember, we can't bring drinks or food back in here. I know there's cup holders, but they're